to Bad Ideas, the show where we take a look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea for this week is something that Tony picked out for us. It's a big one.
Yeah, this one is a big bad idea that looked like a really good idea for a little bit. Today we're talking about asbestos.
Asbestos, the miracle rock mineral. Something that we found out about researching this topic that I was surprised by, Tony. Maybe you were not. Maybe most people wouldn't be. But I've heard of asbestos my whole life. I know that it has problems. I know that it's really good at retarding flames. I know all the basics. I had, at some point, just assumed that it was an artificial synthetic product.
Yeah, so did I. Asbestos is actually a naturally occurring silicate mineral.
They mine it.
Yeah, and it looks so strange, whenever you actually see, a vein of it. Because you can really go up to it and just kind of, peel it off. And it's just these very, very thin strands of, crystalline fibers that are just naturally occurring out in the wilderness.
And up as far as 4,000 years ago, we know that people knew about asbestos. It wasn't until much more recently, though, that it became a part of larger industrialized production and large-scale mining operations were put into effect.
Yeah, that started mostly in the late 1800s whenever they started figuring out how to weave it into different materials. Yeah, the first major mines were actually set up in Quebec, Canada, and then moved all over the United States and into Europe. What was asbestos used for? It was pretty much used for everything. You're talking about insulation, pajamas, cigarette filters, and so much more. In construction alone, it was used in concrete to make better, stronger concrete, drywall, roofing, flooring, plumbing, insulation, pretty much anything that you could think of except for the framing of a house could be done with asbestos. Even the roofing tiles and everything else, because it didn't catch on fire, because it was corrosion proof, and so many other things that were very ideal for building. It was even electrical resistant. And
it was very strong, too. The fibers made it, for a construction material, also made it incredibly durable, or at least it helped other things be more durable.
Yeah, and that's what we were saying with the concrete. Basically, you're putting a type of, webbing throughout the concrete so that it has something better to hold on to and just grip to, and it would make these... It was used in pretty much anything you could think of, too. Even in 1939's Wizard of Oz, the snow that's falling was made of asbestos. It was just all over the place. Which they switched
away. I love this. They switched away from the cotton snow because a fireman told them, oh, that cotton might catch on fire. Use some of this asbestos. Just sprinkle it all over everybody. It'll be perfectly safe, and it's a wonder material. And why is this a bad idea, Tony?
Well, it causes cancer. Flat out. As early as 1899, Dr. Montague Murray found that asbestos caused fatal lung conditions. The first official death came in 1906. In 1924, asbestos made its way into medical publications. Dr. W.E. Cook performed an autopsy on a woman who died at the age of 33 after she worked 17 years in a factory creating asbestos products. He was also the first one to come up with the name asbestosis for the type of condition it was.
The way that this disease works is essentially because asbestos is so indestructible and so tiny, little pieces of it will end up getting inhaled in anybody who's working around it into their lungs and get stuck in the lungs. And having stuff that's not supposed to be in your body stuck in your body for a long time is never a recipe for happy things when it comes to your health.
Yeah, and they would these strands or fibrils would get so caught in the lungs. If you look at asbestos under a microscope, it's basically just shards and spears. These are the types of things that you would be breathing in. They would just stab into your lungs and never leave. You would get this scarring called fibrosis. Originally, asbestosis was called pulmonary fibrosis because it was just scarring of the lungs. After they took some slides of people who had died from this, they basically found that their entire lungs were just filled with these crystals stabbing into all the soft tissue in the lungs. And a lot of it also went into the stomach just from ingestion, too.
So, I have a question, Tony. We knew about this back in 1924. That's the latest that you can say that sort of people were finding out about it. Obviously, there was some research before then, but that's when it is brought to the mainstream public's attention. However, my recollection of history is that it doesn't really start getting banned until the 1970s.
Yeah, that's something that it's a little bit mysterious how it was able to go so very long. Like, as early as 1918, you had people in the Prudential Life Insurance Company stopping the issuing of life insurance policies to people working in asbestos factories. Like, that's 1918, where they're just like, no, we're not going to cover them because they're dying all over the... Like, they actually put out a report in 1918 in the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics saying that the workers were having an unusually high death rate. And, like, that's back before, like, really OSHA was around to take care of any of this stuff. Like, this is just them being, like, too dangerous, not covered.
And nobody... By the way, at this point, nobody does anything. These guys just stop covering the factory workers.
Yeah, well, it's not their job to fix it.
That's true.
But
whose job was it to fix it? I would assume the asbestos company. Surely they saw this, Tony. 1920, the asbestos companies see that there's this big problem and they do something, right?
Well, they would go on till 1933 before anything was done about it, and it's not exactly the thing you want to have done. In 1933, the Denver-based Johns Manville Corp., which was one of the biggest manufacturers of asbestos products in the world, had 11 of their workers file a lawsuit against them, demanding compensation for the damage that they had done. Meeting secretly, the Johns Manville...
Probably would have been a lot more if they hadn't all been being died off.
Yeah, pretty much. And that's and we'll get to some numbers behind that here in a little bit. Meeting in secrecy, the Johns Manville Board of Directors instructed the company president to strike a deal with an attorney representing the workers. The company paid a total of $30,000 to settle the claims for these 11 workers, but only with the provision that the attorney would not directly or indirectly participate in bringing new actions against the corporation.
Even back, I know that inflation's a thing, and $30,000 back in 1933 money would have been a substantial amount. I haven't done the calculation, but I feel like spreading that amount across 11 people for your incredibly life-threatening but your mineral that you've made them work with is really not much of a help.
Yeah, I really don't think it would be that much. Even today, like, you're looking at, there's been a lot of trusts set up to help pay for the deaths and well-being of people affected by asbestos. It's a $100 billion trust, and they say that's about 10% of what's needed to actually cover the human cost of asbestos. That's a little bit more modern. That's something that happened in the 70s and 80s. This is back to the 1930s. 2 years later, in 1935, A.S. Rossiter, the editor of Asbestos, an industry trade magazine...
No, these guys... I feel like from the name of this magazine, we can get a read on whose side the Asbestos magazine is going to be on.
Pretty much. Like, in this letter he wrote, "Always you've requested that for certain obvious reasons we publish nothing about asbestosis, and naturally your wishes have been respected." So, like, they know full on about asbestosis, and they just decided to not say anything about it in their trade magazine, which makes sense from a business perspective, but it's like, that's pretty glaringly obvious. It's like when the cigarette companies had doctors saying that, "Oh, I choose this brand." It's like, you know it's not good for you. A few days later, the corporate counsel would end up writing, "I think the less said about asbestos, the better off we are," in response to this letter. And basically, they're just trying to make it so that they have their product and nobody talks about anything there. But this might actually be the beginnings of a much larger cover-up.
Now, there is another big factor to this, because you might be asking yourself, if you're listening to this, why wouldn't the government do something about this? Companies are well known for not necessarily having people's best interests at heart, but the government is supposed to be there for us to protect us from these big, bad corporations that are only interested in profits. What did they do to stop the spread of asbestos in the 1930s and 40s, Tony?
They decided to use millions of tons of it. Basically, during the beginnings of World War II, ship production was launched into overdrive. over 14 million Americans were put to work to build the American war machine, and more than 4.3 million of those people would actually be just working on ships. You're talking about such a massive surge that we went from 394 vessels in 1939 to 6,768 in 1945. And you needed those 4 million people working around the clock 7 days a week to build and service these ships. Every one of these ships required literal tons of asbestos, like the millboard that was up there to make it so that it was flame retardant, the insulation around pipes. Almost every part of the ship had some form of asbestos around it. Like, that was just how they did it. And the biggest problem about this is whenever you're working in an enclosed area, you're literally sawing these pieces, like with bandsaws and everything, to make them fit perfectly onto the ship. You're putting giant clouds of asbestos into a closed area and putting people in there without respirators. Now, it wasn't that they didn't entirely know that there were some problems there. Like, back in the 1930s, the Navy had set up guidebooks for using respirators and other means to protect the lungs. But due to the demand and size of the workplace and the speed at which these ships had to be built, workforce regulations were not really abided by.
We had to win the war, Tony. We had to save all those lives. You don't understand.
And that's
the
an
men
assertion.
who were going to go over there and fight could die.
That's actually an assertion that the government would later make, that there was no way to win the war without putting these people's lives at risk, that they were basically putting themselves in a similar spot as frontline soldiers.
And how many of these people who worked on the ships died?
Well, imagine it this way. Like, I didn't get like a full-on actual number for this because it's a little bit weird with asbestosis, because it can cause so many other problems that don't get put on like a death certificate. If you were to go to World War II as a serviceman, 18 in every 1,000 people that went over there ended up killed. The people working on the docks, 14 in 1,000 ended up dying directly of asbestosis.
And I would imagine that back home you probably had a lot more women working, because that was a big deal in World War II. Because we don't want to send those people to the front lines, but we can keep them back home where it's safe and the government will protect them from bad things.
And on top of this, like, one of the main concerns about asbestos is that it wasn't just the people working at the factories. It was the fact that they would go home and their clothes would be covered in asbestos, and it would infect the families back at home. Like, somebody would like just pats the asbestos off of a coat, and all of a sudden you're putting literal millions of asbestos particles into the air. It's a weird substance because it is so light that it actually floats on air for hours at a time. So you go home, you do your laundry, all of a sudden you've just put that all into the air for your kids to breathe, for you to breathe. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. Like, the next question we're looking at is, like, how was the U.S. government complicit in this oversight?
So do we know for a fact that the U.S. government knew that this was a problem and willingly covered it up, or at least did not warn people sufficiently?
There's some definite evidence of this, especially because the Navy did have people in charge of the well-being for soldiers, for people working in the shipyards, for everything else. Commander C.S. Stevenson, the Navy's Surgeon General and Chief Officer of Preventative Medicine, wrote of the asbestos workers in shipyards, "I'm certain that we're not protecting the men as we should." By 1943, they set some new ventilation standards that were added to naval shipyards, but the production far outstripped these, and they weren't able to get these ventilation standards out in time to actually do anything. Basically, this led to a lot of back and forth between the government and asbestos manufacturers and corporations, saying that the executives of these corporations didn't properly warn the U.S. government of the dangers of asbestos, and the asbestos makers saying, well, you didn't follow your own standards, so how can we be culpable for this? And that wasn't really anything that ever got entirely resolved. Later, a long time later, actually, whenever they were starting to put these court cases together, which currently there's, I think, 8,000 different cases with 75,000 different claimants right now, like, as of this moment, going for asbestos claims. But in this particular case, Dr. Leonard Goldwater, a naval industrial health officer during World War II, testified in 1988 that the Navy could have built ships during the war in ways that would have minimized health risks, that they just didn't put the time into making it.
For all of those thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives lost in the war production, do we consider them casualties, or are they just the result of incompetence?
I'd say it's probably a little bit of both. Whenever you're putting out that many people and you're asking for sacrifice from soldiers overseas, and you're trying to build this giant war machine, Like, there's going to be some things that don't quite work out well. But I feel like they could have, even if they would have gotten these people proper respirators, like, there probably would have been half as many deaths as could have happened. But with the way modern asbestos has to be produced, I'm not sure that would have been the case either, because they were still having it on their clothes. So whenever they went home, they would have still been breathing it in. It's more that it might have taken less time for these to come in, because a lot of these people lived into their 40s and 50s before the asbestosis really killed them.
Well, at least now we know, Tony, and nobody is foolish enough to continue using this incredibly lethal product in their everyday lives, right?
Well, that's where it gets a little bit weird. First, let's go to Russia.
All right. Everybody loves going to Russia these days.
I mean, there were several meetings that could have happened there. Anyway.
No, they came over here for those, Tony.
Recently, Vice magazine took a trip over to Asbestos, Russia, which is one of the largest producers of asbestos in the world. More than 50% of the world's current asbestos comes from the mines in Asbestos, Russia. And whenever they got there, they were kind of appalled to see, like, the reporter walked up to this area where it's a giant open strip mine operation, and she's wearing, like, what looks to be a hazmat suit, which is pretty much what the US and Europe has people wear when they're working on asbestos. And she's watching them use dynamite to just blow these hills away, sending clouds and clouds of asbestos into the air. And as they're sitting there, the locals are just, like, walking their dogs, not wearing any sort of protection, being like, oh, it's pretty, and you don't have to worry about it unless you're afraid of it. It's only when you're afraid of it can it kill you.
Wow, the Christian Scientists would do real well over there.
Yeah. And it's just kind of striking to see, because also their doctors over there are a little bit different, especially the ones in Asbestos, Russia. Like, she went and did an interview with a doctor who literally had a chunk of asbestos on his desk, just sitting there so people could pick up. And he was talking about how, like, it's all overblown, it's not that bad for people. And, like, the way he was talking, it did not seem like it was genuine. It seemed like he was paid off, but we can't really know that. But whenever you actually go deeper into Russia and see what they're doing with their own research, it's kind of like the cigarette industries. They're showing that you aren't having, like, these deaths happen because of this. It's always from something else. It's actually illegal in Russia to put asbestosis on a death certificate. Like, you can't put that or mesothelioma on a death certificate in Russia. And mesothelioma, which I think we accidentally glossed over, is a cancer that is directly caused by asbestos. It basically, the mesothelial tissue in the lungs, the thin layer of protection inside the lungs, gets coated in this, and it causes a cancer that can form tumors and various other things. But
nope, fake news, Tony.
in Russia, you're not allowed to actually put that on the death certificate. You just say lung cancer. So we don't actually have data on how much it's affecting it here. But there are parts of the world that are still using this all the time. Like, a lot of the stuff they were using, probably the materials weren't that bad unless you have to cut it, which, you know, in construction that happens all the time. Like, you're talking about roofing tiles and all sorts of things, and this is just what they were showing in that particular documentary. The World Health Organization has called into question the research done by Russians, and they're basically saying that it's a complete farce. That seems to be a full-on cover-up by the Russian government because they don't want to lose the income from the asbestos mines.
Well, at least, Tony, I mean, the Russians might have their thing, but at least it's illegal over here, and no Americans are in danger of asbestos being in their homes anymore, right?
Oh, you'd like to think that, wouldn't you? Like,
I would like to think that.
Originally banned in 1970 in the Clean Air Act, asbestos was kind of taken off the table for use. Again, in 1989, the EPA issued a ban on most contaminated products, but this ruling was overturned by a New Orleans court. So basically, there aren't full-on restrictions of asbestos use in the United States anymore. The only ban that went through is that you can't buy flooring felt, roll board, and certain types of paper made from asbestos.
So why is this a bad idea, Tony? What's the baddest idea of all these bad ideas?
I'd say the biggest bad idea of all of this is the denial about how bad it is. Like, you've got people that from the 1920s knew how bad this was for human beings, and they still didn't do anything, and they still didn't do anything until the 1970s. And now, today, you can still make stuff out of it. Like, products today like brake pads, automobile clutches, roofing materials, vinyl tile, cement piping, corrugated sheeting, home insulation, and potting soils can still have some asbestos in them. I think the only reason why they don't is because because people now know that asbestos is bad for you. It's not anything that the government is doing. They're basically taking a position of like just a hands-off position on how dangerous this substance actually is. It's just so clear that it's so bad for you. Like, all you have to do is take a look at Libby, Montana to really see it. You're talking about a town of 3,000 people, and because they were mining vermiculite mostly in Libby, and there was asbestos deposits inside that, and now more than 1,500 people in a town of 3,000 have asbestosis. Not even the miners. Like, the miners almost entirely had it, but because the factory was literally next to a school and ballpark, it was just literally raining asbestos ashes onto these communities.
And I'd like to point out as well, not only is it something that has been denied in the past, and not only is it something that Russia is denying, but there are people even today, as we were doing the research for this podcast, that were writing columns and articles saying, it's not that bad, you guys. You weird liberal snowflakes. You can't handle the asbestos. You're blowing it all out. Everybody's a victim. You know, you have that sort of victim hating idea, a conservative idea, I would say. Not that I hate conservatism, but sometimes that comes up. And there are still people in America, like normal, well-educated, regular people, who are poo-pooing the idea that asbestos is this incredibly dangerous killer. And I would say, need to be vigilant that it does not become an even worse idea than it already has been.
Yeah, I mean, with the EPA having a lot of its power stripped in the last couple of years, like, you're going to see issues where chemicals like these start making their way back into manufacturing. And even
you can absolutely see the appeal, because it is an amazing material if it didn't kill you.
Yeah, if we were synthetic robots or something like that, but then we wouldn't need insulation.
Well, we need electrical insulation, Tony.
That's true. That's very true.
Well, I think that will wrap it up for this week. Kind of a bummer, Tony.
Yeah, this was a downer episode. We're going to try to bring something a little more lighthearted to you guys in about 2 weeks. We haven't decided fully what the topic's going to be, but we got a whole list. Also, if you have ideas that you think would be good for the Bad Ideas podcast, send them to
badideasshow@gmail.com.
We'll definitely take a look at those and see if it fits the criteria.
And don't forget, we always want to close with this. Many times, good ideas can look like bad ideas, and bad ideas can look like good ideas. And sometimes the only way to tell the difference is to try. Just don't try any asbestos.
Yeah, let's skip over that.
That's
one.
been tried. We figured it out, guys. Let's do different ones. Let's do new bad ideas now.
Yes. Fail hard, but not quite as hard as asbestos.
Fail forward.
Yes. All right, this has been a production of Human Echoes. If you liked it, check out humanechoes.com or our Patreon page. Look at becoming a member, support this show, and I hope you guys have an awesome week.
Bye, guys.